the Easter Rising happens 1916,
Yeah.
and executions happen. We get to 1920. Ireland is still struggling for independence. Is the War of Independence on at that point? There's black
It's
and
been on
tans
for
in the
about
country, right?
Yes, it's been on for 2 years, and what's basically happened is over that 2 years, you've seen a mass exodus through resignation of RIC officers around the country, the Royal Irish Constabulary. So, in order to maintain law and order, the British government decided to employ former British officers in two groups. One group is known as the auxiliaries, and the other group is known as a kind of or sent in to take over from the RIC as the Black and Tans, and they are basically uniformed using police tops, which are black, and because there's a shortage of uniforms, they get khaki pants, hence the name Black and Tans. So they're recruited from basically former British Army. They're given good pay. They're almost like your Blackwater type. It's a familiar tune. They're like Blackwater in Iraq. They're kind of ex-American, so like in Blackwater or in Iraq, they were ex-American soldiers, and they were employed.
Were they like mercenaries? Was there a great incentive?
Good pay, yeah. It was a lot of good danger money. These guys were generally not nice people. Their behaviour when they came to Ireland was vicious, but they were given that was their mission statement was to go in and terrorise the Irish people into submission. But it backfired massively, and it was a public relations disaster. The Black and Tans helped the British lose the propaganda war. So the Tans, as they became known, had Irish men in it. They weren't just all British. There was a good few Irishmen in their organisation. Hence, last year when they decided to commemorate the RIC, it caused such a furore, But a lot of people wouldn't know that there would have been a good few. They weren't all British men. They were a good few were more Irish. But so this period that we're talking about is a heavy duty period for events, because just before this, the events, the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday, you had the death of Terence McSweeney. So you had that commemoration. Exactly. Who influenced many revolutionaries from here all the way to Vietnam and Africa. His death was a massive impact on Imperial Britain and on Britain's colonies. And his death influenced in the manner in which he died. And the statement that he made that, it's not the person who can hurt the most that will win, it's the one who can endure the most. And that was something that was taken on by Gandhi and was taken on by Ho Chi Minh, and etc. So you had that.
Sylvester Stallone might have stolen it as well.
Did he?
I think so.
Yeah, possibly, yeah.
Some of his Rocky films. And McSweeney, was that 100 years anniversary also?
That happened in September. His death happens in September 1918 or 1920. And then following that, you have there's a lot of activity around Ireland. It's probably the height of the Irish War of Independence. There are engagements all over the country. There's over 50,000 British soldiers engaged in Ireland, divided into two divisions. It's a massive amount. You can think like in the UK, there was 15,000 British soldiers. In Ireland, you had 50,000. That was RIC, auxiliaries, Black and Tans, and then various regiments. So you had the RAF were being used. You had tanks. You had armoured cars. And they were up against around 15,000 volunteers who were working in rotation as flying columns. And these flying columns were having a devastating effect on the infrastructure of the country and the British Army itself. They were claiming a lot of results in their attacks on the British Army. But in Dublin, bringing us up to Bloody Sunday, in Dublin, the IRA were having difficulty because they, like all Irish revolutions, had been infiltrated by spies and networks of spies. And in one particular intelligence network, it was called the Cairo Gang. And there was just a bunch of British officers who were employed to develop assets within the IRA's intelligence infrastructure. However, the British didn't know that the IRA had their own intelligence infrastructure, and they had developed assets themselves within Dublin Castle, which was the centre of British military intelligence in Ireland. And I think, I'm not exactly sure, but I do believe that a list of the Cairo Gang and their names and addresses was found by accident by some cleaners, and was forwarded on to Michael Collins, who had his own version of the Cairo Gang. And the morning of Bloody Sunday, he got them to pay a visit to. They found the addresses of these various members of the Cairo Gang, and they went about. They were all located in the same area, and they went about summarily executing these officers. Now, apparently, they didn't get them all, but they got a good number of them.
And these officers were spying on Ireland, essentially.
They were basically handlers. They handled assets. So
were they Irish men being treacherous, or were they British?
Most were British,
agents?
but a couple of them were Irish, and one gentleman was just a British Army officer, who, incidentally, interestingly enough, apparently, his family, he had cousins or he had relatives that were involved with the Tipperary team that were going to be playing later in the day. I'm not exactly sure that, but he was definitely had GAA connections. But he had nothing to do with the Cairo Gang. He was just a British Army officer in Dublin, and he was an Irishman, and he just so happened to be at one of the addresses that Collins's squad, as they were called, were sent to, and he was executed. So there was a good number of them shot dead. Now, it just so happened that day that there was a big Gaelic football match in Ireland's premier sporting stadium, which was Croke Park, between the Dublin Gaelic football team and the Tipperary Gaelic football team.
Okay.
And they, everyone kind of knew that following that morning there would be a reprisal, but nobody suspected that it would be at in such full view of the public. But anyway, decisions were made by British HQ, by the general in command. I can't remember the British Army general's name. But anyway, he decided that it would be a good chance that there was Tipperary operatives up from the Tipperary flying columns brought in for these executions. So he assumed that they could capture a good number of them in Croke Park. And Croke Park at this stage was packed. There was over 20,000 people in the stadium. So they decided that they would go in from the canal end and go in from what is now known as the Hill 16 end. And they would surround it. And then as people were exiting the match, they would search them. Anyone found with firearms would be brought, and, if you were found with a firearm, you'd be executed. That was standard. So they turn up, and so that's the British point of view. It was just, we're going to search.
An operation to capture suspected militants, and as you say, execute them. But
if you're looking at British Army behaviour in Afghanistan and British Army behaviour in Australia, the Australian SAS and stuff like that, you know that there's read between the lines orders coming down from upon high that go and sort these boys out, pay them a visit, send them a message, and that was what they were going to do. So they turn up, the auxiliaries exit their trucks, they set up a perimeter, they start moving in towards two ends. The first person who's shot dead is a 10-year-old boy who's sitting on a tree watching a match. So the British later on try and paint it out that they have shots fired upon him, which
we hear this a lot from the British Army.
Yeah. So, but there wasn't. There was some revisionist historians were trying to say that IRA lookouts fired warning shots, Again, there's literally no proof of this. This is just something, it was just kind of basically made up, I think, in the last few years. Anyway, they enter the ground, they start shooting. It causes a mass panic. People start trying to go for the tunnels. So as soon as the shooting starts at the canal end, the British on the other side hear the shooting and begin shooting. So now you've got people funneling out of the ground being shot at. And within a few minutes, you have a woman shot dead who was about to be married in 4 days. She was shot dead with her fiance. They shoot dead a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 14-year-old. They shoot a player called Michael Hogan, who one of the big stands in Croke Park is named after.
And a boy tried to pray next to him, is that right? And was shot dead. Someone tried to come onto the pitch to pray next to the dying player, I heard. And also was shot dead.
I'm not exactly sure about that one.
How many casualties in total was it, Brian?
There was 70 casualties in total. Some of those casualties are crush victims, and the rest were people who were shot dead. So I think it was it 15 people shot dead? On the day it was 13, but I think 2 people died later of their wounds. I'm not exactly sure. I'll have to check up the figures, but basically that's the timeline.
Wow.
That night,
what an atrocity.
it was just unfortunate. There was 2 IRA prisoners, and a very elaborate escape scene was created, and they were both shot dead as well. Apparently, they had wrestled their guns off the British Army officers looking after them, had tried to exit Dublin Castle, or one of the barracks up there, and they were both shot. And it was a very elaborate scene, and photographs were taken to prove that but they had been already tortured severely. So this was basically what happened, and it was a public relations nightmare for the British, because British people were actually revolted by what they heard. You know, people at a football match shot dead. You just can't gloss it up. It was a nightmare. And the IRA and the Republican movement in America and, used it to full effect. And it was a tremendous propaganda coup, because if it had been left alone, the execution of the British Army officers in their own homes, sometimes in front of their family members, would have been kind of quite a difficult thing for the IRA to gloss up.
It would have been a good propaganda chip.
Yes.
I guess.
But the British in Ireland during that period, they just didn't. There was not good at spinning things, and not very good. How they reacted every time was disastrous, and it just put another nail.
Might is right. What was their logic?
The logic is, I suppose,
well, maybe news didn't travel as quickly back then. Did they think they could get away with massacring people at as football stadium?
A lot of these officers would have been in South Africa. They would have been in different colonies and suppressed things. And this was how it worked, and it worked. They thought it worked, or had seen it to work in the past. But, this was kind of, bleeding the British. I mean, the interesting thing is the British didn't realize was that within a year, the IRA were pretty close to being without ammunition and existing on very little. But they didn't notice. It was one of the interesting things about the coming year. The IRA intensified there over the next 12 months, but the British didn't realize that intensification was at a cost, that they were using up their reserves and their manpower. And there was a couple of disastrous operations that happened over the next year. So, and
this was just after the First World War, right? So
yeah,
presumably the ranks were wearing thin already, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there was Bloody Sunday would have seen a lot of, so again, it promoted a lot of young men to want to join the IRA. Manpower wasn't a problem. It was war material. British had an unlimited supplies of weapons and material to fight this, but they were struggling to deal with this type of campaign, and they were unable to pin down the IRA, and everything they did just seemed to backfire. And a lot of future superstars of the British Army were in Ireland at the time. Montgomery was in Cork. The general who surrendered Singapore during the Second World War, he had his time.
Oh, wow.
It was going on in Cork as well. So a lot of the big guys were there, but they were not dealing with this very well. And their reactions just made it worse. They just kept pouring petrol onto the fire. But incidentally, this weekend is another interesting anniversary because a black and tan column or auxiliary column in West Cork was completely annihilated to the man. And these were like the SAS of the day. They were all very experienced British soldiers. So the fact that not one man survived kind of tells you that this was revenge for Bloody Sunday. But it was not just was it bad for the British Army, it was terrible for their morale, because this was some of their best soldiers and there was 18 of them dead. And they were losing men every day, and their reaction was they'd go and burn a town, burn a village, and it was just getting worse and worse and worse. So this weekend would be the anniversary of the Kilmichael ambush by Tom Barry, who was an ex-British soldier himself. And Tom used his... He's an interesting guy. He wrote a book called Guerrilla's Days in Ireland.
And he would be very sceptical of Michael Collins, am I right?
He didn't like Michael Collins, no.
Okay. And this is a man who survived into a ripe old age. And there are interviews of him later in life talking about how Michael Collins would be a traitor in his eyes, possibly. We don't have to go into that too much tonight. But Tom Barry, a hero of the IRA.
Yeah, he fought in Iraq, and
having fought for the British, he saw
fought in Iraq. Yeah.
what they did. Roger, I mean, many of these people. Roger Casement, I think, was he not also a British soldier at some point?
He was involved with the British. He was sent on missions to oversee how colonial occupations were going and stuff like that.
Because he became Sir Roger Casement somehow. So he must have done something the Brits like.
That was for his report on the Belgian Congo.
Okay. So these people saw what colonialism was and didn't want it at home, I'm guessing.
It's very interesting. Tom Barry in 1913, 1912 was... Tom Barry, he was holding a Union Jack when the King of England came to Cork. But within 5-6 years, this man who was, I suppose, fond of the British Empire, was a subject of the British Empire, had gone the other way. So it's events like Bloody Sunday and 1916, and I suppose what happened to the Connacht Rangers. That's another event that actually is happening at the same time. There's a mutiny in India. So there's a lot going on. The Connacht Rangers in India have mutinied because of the Black and Tans, what they're doing in Mayo and Galway.
The Connacht being an Irish regiment in
the British Army.
The British Army, yeah. Okay.
So this is all happening in 1920, September, November, October, November, and going into December. And it kind of finishes, it kind of culminates with the Mayor of Cork being executed by the RIC and the burning down of Cork City by the British Army, who loot and pillage the city, shoot at the fire brigade as they attempt to oversee the city. And so this is like that period. It's this period of events is kind of the culmination of the War of Independence.
We're going through this decade of anniversaries, as they call it, and these significant moments in Irish history, and most of them are turning a century old now. We just had 100 years since that Bloody Sunday. Do you think, as these events slip out of living memory, there's a danger of what they said would happen in Palestine, whereby the old will die and the young will forget, because there's so few people left, or perhaps no one left, who remembers what it's like to walk and breathe and live in a island that isn't partitioned. How will we ever do away with that partitioning and have a united Ireland, and this time outside of the United Kingdom? I'm thinking of, I think Joe Cahill said, I was born in a united Ireland and I wish to die in one. And he has, of course, since passed away. Is it slipping out of the memory? Do people like Leo Varadkar have no concept of what it means to strive for Irish unification? Hence, he's trying to commemorate the Black and Tans. Is there a danger of a window of opportunity being missed? I don't want to sound pessimistic. I hope you're going to tell me I'm wrong.
No, I think it's a very interesting question. You're talking about who benefits from a united Ireland and who stands to lose out in a united Ireland. I mean, the main political parties in the south, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, will lose out because any kind of united Ireland would mean that Sinn Féin would be the most dominant political party on the entire island, because they rule the north. And look, I mean, the DUP will not accept that. With the population will have to, the numbers will have to change on the ground. But I mean, at this stage, I mean, of the 6 counties, Derry, Tyrone, Fermanagh, Armagh, West Belfast, South Down, they're all, the majority of the people in that area would vote for a united Ireland. Now, there's a lot of people in the south that wouldn't, because they've grown up with this idea of this Republic of Ireland thing, and it's almost in their interest to maintain it, like these Fine Gael people and stuff like that. Because after the war and after the Civil War, the Fine Gael party, which was Cumann na Gael back then, these people, they set themselves up as the British replacements. So they had the same kind of school system. They occupied the higher ranks of the military, the Free State Army. They had a lot of them would have had connections to the Irish Parliamentary Party, and would fawn for the days of the British being in charge, and they kind of set themselves up apart, And
is Leo Varadkar the modern day descendant of that tradition then?
Yes,
Fine Gael
so.
party. Okay,
very much so. Private schools, there's nothing. Private school, but also like he's a very image obsessed political operator. Just a bit of a, as they say in Ireland, he's a bit of a Sleveen, a snake, as they say. He's just that. He doesn't really stand for anything. He was against gay marriage. He was against abortion. He was against all the. Oh yeah, he was against all these things. He was in the pro-Israel group in the Dáil. He occupies all these different kind of funny positions. I think because of his college, he went to Trinity, as well, which was, they used to fly the Union Jack in Trinity, and they used to have a up until very not long ago, and they used to always it was a great recruiting ground for British officers, apparently. So he's from that ilk. We call him West Brits.
Yeah. That's amazing. On the one hand, coming across as so modern and liberal, whatever liberal means, but not actually being in favour of progressing the country towards unity.
Yes,
on an all island.
Yes, that's it. That's him. That's him all over. Look, I think there's a lot of unionist farming people. It's in their interest for United Ireland economically.
Well, it sounds like, ironically, the public opinion in the north may well sway towards reunification before it is fully taken on board in the south. Are we going to have to win over the south more than even the north.
I think, it depends. It depends on optics, and it depends. Look, I mean, here's the thing. People talk about, we can't afford the north. The north can't afford the south. The north actually has a very good health system. What I would like to see is that if we go for unification, we're going to have a national health system that's based on the NHS, not this kind of dual private public type thing that we have going on in the south, which is basically, you've got in the south of Ireland, you have rampant neoliberalism economics at work. It's on steroids. You've got privatization of almost every facet of a large number of state institutions, like job seekers, the dole, fostering, the hospital system. They've basically tried to privatize every single aspect of society, and that's Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are kind of responsible for that. And when you go up to 6 counties, people, they kind of Fine Gael like to say, look at Sinn Féin, they only give people £100 up at the north for the COVID payment, but in the south we're giving people €320. The interesting thing is the £100 in the north goes a hell of a long way, because the price of things are a lot cheaper. Whereas in the south, it's one of the most expensive places in Europe. The price of property. You're dealing with such neoliberal we're dealing with the same type of people that James Connolly and Jim Larkin were fighting against back in 1913. These money people that will sacrifice the nation's housing infrastructure so that some people can make a buck. Like right now in Dublin, they're trying to push co-living as a means to deal with the property crisis, because they don't want, in the middle of a pandemic, they want people to be sharing kitchens and toilet facilities, and that's their way of dealing with homelessness and dealing with a lack of housing, because they've taken everything that was done by local city councils and given it to the private developers. So unless it makes money, the government aren't interested in it. So you've got those kind of problems. So there's a huge range of issues that need to be dealt with. On positive side, you see the Dublin unions going up and standing alongside Harland and Wolff workers and stuff like that. But will we be able to get over that final hurdle between the two communities? I don't know. I think it's inevitable, but the shape of what it takes will be another story.
And that will be another video. Brian,
Yes.
Thank you so much for speaking to me, mate. Nice one.
Julian, always pleasure.
Appreciate it. Wonderful.
Don't forget to talk soon.
Good man.